France 778 AD. The pass of Rono in the Pyrenees Mountains. The air is thin and cold, and the sound of dying men echoes off rock walls that have stood since before anyone in this army was born. A rear guard of Charlemagne's army is being slaughtered by Basque fighters who materialize from the mountain slopes with the precision of men who know every ridge and every shadow in their own territory. The wagons are burning. The horses are screaming. The rear guard is cut off from the main army ahead of it and from any possibility of rescue behind it. The commander of the rear guard is a young knight named Roland. He is the most famous warrior in the Frankish world, the bravest, the most reckless. The man who carries a sword called Durel and an ivory horn called Oliphant, and who refuses to blow that horn to summon help because blowing it would mean admitting that he cannot win alone. By the time he finally raises the horn to his lips and blows, the sound splitting the mountain air with a cry that reaches Charlemagne miles ahead, it is too late. Roland dies in the pass with his face toward the enemy and his sword beneath his body so that no one can take it from him. This is the story the Song of Roland tells. The most celebrated epic poem of medieval Europe, the foundation of the chivalric tradition, the text that defined heroism for 500 years. The poem identifies Roland as Charlemagne's nephew, his sister's son. The word nephew appears in the text with an emphasis and a frequency that exceeds what the narrative requires. Roland is the nephew. Always the nephew. The poem insists on this word the way a man insists on a locked door when he knows what is behind it. For 1,000 years, the word was taken at face value. Roland was Charlemagne's nephew. The relationship was familial but simple. Uncle and sister's son, a bond of blood, but not of scandal. Then scholars began examining the literary traditions that fed into the Song of Roland, the older oral traditions, the Italian chanson d'oeuvre, the fragmentary sources that a poem's authors drew on when they composed the version that survived. What they found behind the word nephew was a tradition so disturbing that the poets who preserved it had encrypted the truth in the only code available to them. A word that meant one thing on the surface and another thing entirely to those who understood what medieval literary convention used it to conceal. Roland, the great hero of French literature, the paragon of knightly virtue, may not have been Charlemagne's nephew at all. He may have been Charlemagne's son, not by a wife, not by a concubine, by his own sister. The relationship that the poem encodes beneath the word nephew is a relationship between brother and sister that produced a child who became a hero who became a legend, and a legend that was built on a secret so devastating that the men who wrote it down buried the truth inside a single word and trusted that no one would dig it up. Someone did. And what the excavation revealed about Charlemagne, about what he did to the women of his own family, about the private life that the most powerful man in Christendom conducted behind the walls of the most celebrated court in Europe has been erased from every textbook and every classroom that teaches the story of the father of Europe, Charlemagne. The name means Charles the Great. Like Alexander before him, the adjective has been attached so long that it functions as a label rather than a judgment. You learned about him in school, the wise Christian emperor, the patron of learning who gathered scholars from across Europe and sparked the Carolingian Renaissance. The unifier who forged the warring barbarian kingdoms into something resembling civilization for the first time since Rome fell. The man crowned emperor of the Romans by the Pope on Christmas Day of 800 AD. A moment that every European history textbook presents as the birth of Western Christians. The image on the playing card, the King of Hearts in a French deck, is Charlemagne. The image in the cathedral. He was canonized and his relics are venerated in Aachen to this day. Pilgrims visit. Tourists photograph. The story of the father of Europe is carved into stone and painted onto glass and printed into the curriculum of every school that teaches Western civilization as a narrative of progress from darkness into light. The reality was more complicated than the playing card. Charlemagne was a man of extraordinary contradictions. He promoted literacy but was barely literate himself. Einhard noting that the emperor tried to learn to write late in life and never fully succeeded. He championed Christianity but conducted a private life that violated its most fundamental moral codes. He built the most powerful empire in post-Roman Europe while maintaining a household so transgressive that his own biographer, a man who lived at court and knew the family personally, struggled visibly with how to describe it. Einhard. The name matters because the man matters. Einhard wrote the Vita Caroli Magnae, the life of Charlemagne, the single most important biography of any medieval monarch. He was not a distant historian working from second-hand sources. He was a member of Charlemagne's inner circle. He knew the family. He attended the meals. He walked the corridors. He saw what happened inside the palace at Aachen. And he made decisions. Careful, deliberate, politically sophisticated decisions about what to include in his biography and how to include it. What Einhard chose to write about Charlemagne's daughters is a masterpiece of controlled revelation. He included enough to preserve the truth. He obscured enough to protect the reputation. And he trusted that future readers would understand the difference between what he said and what he meant. The way a man trusts that someone will eventually find the message he has hidden inside a bottle and thrown into the sea. If you want to understand what Einhard buried in his biography, well, the Song of Roland encrypted in a single word. What happened to the women of Charlemagne's family behind the walls of the most powerful court in Christendom? Then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button because what I'm about to reveal has been managed and suppressed and filed away in academic Latin for 12 centuries. Stay until the end because the final chapter of Charlemagne's story involves what was done with his body after death, and it is stranger and more disturbing than anything. The legend of the father of Europe was designed to let you imagine. Charlemagne was born in 742, the eldest son of Pepin the Short, the first Carolingian king of the Franks. When Pepin died in 768, the kingdom was divided between Charlemagne and his younger brother Carlin. The division lasted 3 years. In 771, Carlin died suddenly. The circumstances were convenient enough that historians have debated their nature for 12 centuries. Charlemagne absorbed his brother's kingdom immediately before Parliament's young sons could mount a claim. The widow and children fled to the court of the Lombard king in Italy. Charlemagne would conquer the Lombards 3 years later. The family disappeared from the historical record. Charlemagne's path to sole power was cleared by a death that arrived at exactly the right moment. It would not be the last time. He conquered with a methodical relentlessness that his contemporaries found both impressive and terrifying. The Lombards fell in 774. The Saxons resisted for 30 years and were broken through a combination of military campaigns and forced mass conversions that included the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day at Verdun in 780. 2. The Avars were destroyed and their treasury, the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of raiding, was seized and distributed among Charlemagne's followers. The Bavarians were absorbed. By 800, when Pope Leo III placed the imperial crown on his head in Rome, Charlemagne ruled an empire stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to central Italy. He was the most powerful man in the Western world, and power of that magnitude operated without external restraint. No one told Charlemagne what he could not do. No institution checked his behavior. No court reviewed his decisions. The church needed him more than he needed the church. The nobles depended on him for their lands and titles. The scholars he patronized repaid his generosity with flattery that reinforced his sense of himself as divinely appointed and therefore beyond the rules that governed ordinary men. His appetites were enormous and they were public. The sources document 5 wives. Himiltrud, the mother of his eldest son, Pepin the Hunchback, whom Charlemagne later set aside. The unnamed Lombard princess married for political alliance and discarded within a year. Hildegard, who bore him 9 children before dying at 25. Fastrada, whom the sources describe as cruel. Lutgard, who died before Charlemagne. After Lutgard's death, he did not marry again. He took concubines instead. At least 4 are named in the sources. The children accumulated 18 at minimum by various women. A count that reflects only the ones the sources bother to record. In Frankish culture, a king's virility was not a private matter. It was evidence of fitness to rule. A king who produced many children demonstrated the vitality that God had invested in his bloodline. The court did not hide Charlemagne's appetites. It celebrated them. What the court could not celebrate, what Einhard could barely bring himself to describe, was the direction those appetites took when they turned inward toward his own blood, toward the women who shared his name and his household, and who could not refuse him, because refusal required a power that no woman in the Frankish world possessed against the man who ruled it. Charlemagne had a sister. The sources name her variously as Gisela or Gillen depending on which tradition is consulted. She was younger than Charlemagne. She appears in the official historical record with a brevity that is itself a form of evidence in a court that documented everything that recorded the gifts given to visiting ambassadors and the weight of bread loaves sold in the imperial markets. The emperor's own sister occupies a space so small that her near absence can only be deliberate. Someone decided that Gisela would not be written about. Someone ensured that the records that might have described her life at court in detail either were not created or did not survive. The silence around her is not the silence of insignificance. It is the silence of management. What survives comes from the margins. The literary traditions that fed into the great epic cycles of medieval French and Italian poetry. The Gesangdaoist, the songs of deeds that were composed from oral traditions older than the written versions by centuries. These traditions contain a story about Charlemagne and his sister that the official court histories do not contain. A story so consistent across multiple independent sources and multiple literary traditions that dismissing it as pure invention requires ignoring the pattern that connects them. The story is this. Charlemagne and his sister had a relationship that went beyond what any brother and sister should share. The relationship produced a child, a son. The son was raised at court under a designation that concealed his true parentage. He was called the emperor's nephew. He grew up to become the most celebrated warrior in the Frankish world. His name was Roland. The Italian literary traditions are the most explicit. The Franco-Italian texts that predate the version of the Song of Roland that survived describe the relationship between Charlemagne and his sister in terms that leave less room for ambiguity than the French texts that followed. They name the sister. They describe the nature of the bond. They identify the child that resulted. The French tradition which produced the canonical Song of Roland is more guarded. It uses the word nephew and repeats it with an insistence that scholars have identified as a literary signal, a flag planted in the text to mark the place where the truth is buried beneath the word that conceals it. The tradition is not a single source. It is a pattern. Multiple texts from multiple regions composed across multiple centuries contain the same essential story. Charlemagne and his sister. A forbidden relationship. A child whose parentage had to be hidden. A hero whose legend was built on a foundation that could never be spoken aloud. The consistency of the pattern across independent sources is the strongest evidence for its basis in a genuine tradition that predates the literary texts and that originated close enough to the historical events to preserve a memory that the official record was designed to erase. The Church would have had every reason to suppress this tradition. Charlemagne was the Church's champion. The man who had been crowned by the Pope. The man who had forced the conversion of the Saxons at sore point. The man whose authority the Church had blessed and whose legacy the Church needed to remain unblemished. A relationship between the emperor and his sister producing a child was not merely a scandal. It was a sin of such severity that the penitential literature of the era classified it in the most extreme category of transgression. A sin that required years of penance. A sin that could theoretically invalidate the spiritual authority that Charlemagne's crown was supposed to represent. The Church had the means, the motive, and the institutional capacity to ensure that this story never reached the official record. It succeeded. The official record is clean, but the literary traditions that operated outside the Church's direct editorial control preserved what the Church erased. The poets remembered what the bishops suppressed. Roland. Say the name in France, and it carries a weight that 1,000 years of repetition have pressed into the language itself. The hero of Renovo, the knight who would not blow his horn, the man who broke his sword against a rock rather than let it be captured, and who died with his face toward the enemy because a Frankish knight does not turn his back. The Song of Roland is the foundational text of French literature. It shaped the concept of chivalric heroism that governed European martial culture for 5 centuries. Every knight who rode to the Crusades carried Roland's story in his imagination the way he carried his sword on his belt. The poem was not entertainment. It was scripture for the warrior class. The poem identifies Roland as Charlemagne's nephew. The word appears dozens of times across the text. Roland is introduced as the nephew. He is referred to as the nephew. He dies as the nephew. The repetition is unusual. In a poem of considerable literary sophistication, the insistence on a single kinship term exceeds what the narrative requires. A modern reader passes the word without pausing. A scholar of medieval literary convention does not. In the literary culture that produced the chanson d'Ageist, certain words carried double meanings that audiences understood and that poets deployed deliberately. Nephew was one of the most significant. Scholars of medieval French literature have documented a pattern in which nephew functioned as a coded term for a son whose parentage could not be publicly acknowledged. Specifically, a son born from a relationship that placed both parents outside the boundaries of what the church and society permitted. The code was not obscure. It was widely understood within the literary tradition. Poets used it because it allowed them to preserve a truth that could not be stated directly, embedding it in a word that communicated one thing to the uninitiated and another to those who knew how to listen. The Song of Roland was composed from older oral traditions. The written version that survives dates to approximately 1040, but the story it tells is set in 778 and draws on traditions that are considerably older than the text. The poets who composed the written version were working with material that had been passed down through generations of oral performance. They inherited the word nephew from that tradition. Whether they understood its coded meaning or simply preserved it as part of the inherited material is debated. What is not debated is that the tradition they drew on contained a version of Roland's origin that the written poem both preserves and conceals. The emotional content of the poem strengthens the interpretation. When Roland dies at Ronzeau, Charlemagne's grief exceeds anything else in the text. The emperor collapses. He tears his beard, a gesture of extreme mourning in Frankish culture. He faints on Roland's body. He cries out that his life has lost its meaning. The grief is total and it is disproportionate to the relationship the poem officially describes. Charlemagne has wives in the poem. He has other companions. He has an empire. But Roland's death breaks him in a way that nothing else does. The grief of an uncle for a nephew can be severe. The grief the poem describes is something else. It is the grief of a parent for a child. A father who has lost a son he could never publicly claim. The poem preserves the emotion even as it conceals its source. The word says nephew. The grief says son. The distance between the two words is the space where the secret lives. And the secret has been living there undisturbed for 1,000 years. The church knew or suspected or understood enough to act without requiring the kind of proof that a formal accusation would demand. The evidence is not a confession or a trial record. It is a pattern of behavior between Charlemagne and the church that historians have interpreted in multiple ways, one of which fits the circumstances more precisely than the others. Medieval penitential handbooks were detailed documents. They catalog sins with a specificity of legal codes prescribing exact penances for exact transgressions. The handbooks that circulated during Charlemagne's era contain entries for the transgression that the literary traditions allege he committed. The entries are not hypothetical. They are detailed. They prescribe years of fasting, public confession in some cases, exclusion from communion, extended pilgrimage. The specificity indicates that the sin was not theoretical. It occurred with enough frequency among the powerful to require a standardized institutional response. Kings and nobles who committed this transgression were managed through a system that the church had developed for precisely this purpose. A system that balanced spiritual discipline against political reality. Charlemagne's relationship with the church was characterized by a generosity so extraordinary that it attracted comment even from contemporaries accustomed to the standard exchanges of royal patronage for ecclesiastical support. He donated land on a scale that transformed the church from a spiritual institution into one of the largest landholders in Europe. He constructed churches and monasteries across his empire with a relentlessness that exceeded what political calculation alone would explain. He fought wars explicitly in defense of papal authority, crossing the Alps to defeat the Lombards at the Pope's request and spending 30 years subduing the Saxons in campaigns framed as missions of Christian expansion. The generosity has been interpreted by historians through multiple lenses. Genuine piety, political strategy, the construction of a mutually beneficial alliance between crown and altar. These interpretations are not wrong, but they are incomplete. A third interpretation exists, one that accounts for the scale and the urgency of Charlemagne's giving in ways that piety and politics alone do not. The generosity was penance. The churches were payment. The monasteries were the price of absolution for a sin that could not be named in any document that might survive, but that the men who managed Charlemagne's spiritual accounts knew required compensation on a scale proportional to its face. Severity. The church had every reason to maintain silence. Charlemagne was the sword of Christendom, the man whose armies enforced conversion. The man whose crown the Pope had placed with his own hands. Exposing the emperor's transgression would have damaged the church as severely as it damaged the emperor because the church's authority in the West was built on the foundation of Charlemagne's legitimacy. The arrangement was mutual. Charlemagne received absolution. The church received an empire's resources. The sin was managed. The secret was kept. The generosity continued for the duration of Charlemagne's reign. Church after church, monastery after monastery. Each one a stone laid over a truth that both parties needed buried. The penitential system was designed for exactly this kind of management. It allowed the church to address the transgressions of powerful men without destroying the political structures those men supported. Silence in exchange for resources. Absolution in exchange for obedience on matters the church cared about. The system worked because both sides benefited from its operation and both sides would be damaged by its failure. Charlemagne built churches. The church built silence. And the secret that connected the two was buried so deep that it took 12 centuries and a generation of literary scholars reading medieval poetry with fresh eyes to begin excavating it. Einhar's account of Charlemagne's daughters is the passage that has consumed historians for 12 centuries. It is the passage where the biographer's loyalty to his subject and his commitment to the truth collide in sentences so carefully constructed that every word carries the weight of what it says and the equal weight of what it does not say. Charlemagne had multiple daughters. The exact number varies by source because the sources disagree on which children survived infancy and which did not. The ones who survived to adulthood included Rotrud, Bertha, Gisela, Theodrada, and Hiltrud. They were raised at court. They were educated, which was unusual for women of any rank in the Frankish world, and which Charlemagne's admirers cite as evidence of his progressive attitudes toward his daughter's development. They were visible participants in court life, present at ceremonies, at diplomatic receptions, at the feasts and religious observances that structured the calendar of the Carolingian court. And not one of them was permitted to marry. Not one. In the entire course of Charlemagne's reign, spanning over 4 decades, he did not allow a single daughter to leave his court through marriage. The refusal was absolute and it was unprecedented. In Frankish royal culture, daughters were the primary instruments of diplomatic alliance. A king married his daughters to the kings and princes and powerful nobles whose loyalty he needed to secure. The marriage of a royal daughter was not a personal matter. It was statecraft. The most effective, the most durable, and the most universally practiced form of statecraft available to a medieval monarch. Charlemagne understood this. He was the most strategically brilliant ruler of his era. He used every other tool of diplomacy with masterful precision. He formed alliances through treaties, through land grants, through the distribution of offices and honors. He married his own sons to women chosen for political advantage. He understood what daughters were for in the machinery of Frankish statecraft because he had used other people's daughters for exactly that purpose his entire career, and he refused to use his own. Every single one of them remained at court unmarried for the duration of his life. Einhard explains the refusal with a single sentence that has echoed through 12 centuries of scholarship. Charlemagne loved his daughter so much that he could not bear to be separated from them. The explanation is presented as paternal devotion, a father who loved his children too deeply to let them go. Read in isolation. The sentence is touching. Read in the context of everything else the sources preserve about Charlemagne's relationship with the women of his family. The sentence changes shape. It becomes less an explanation and more a confession disguised as a compliment. He could not bear to let them go. The words describe possession as love. They describe control as affection. They present a cage as an embrace. The daughters could not leave. They could not establish independent households. They could not build lives beyond the walls of the palace complex at Ain. They could not form alliances that might give them power independent of their father. They existed in a space that was simultaneously the most privileged and most confined in the Frankish world. Visible at every public event, present at every meal, accompanying their father on every journey, and unable to walk through any door that led away from him. What Einhard wrote next is the passage that historians have circled for 12 centuries, the way investigators circle evidence they cannot yet explain, but cannot dismiss. After describing Charlemagne's refusal to let his daughters marry, after offering the explanation of paternal love too deep for separation, Einhard adds a detail that detonates quietly beneath the surface of his careful prose. The arrangement, Einhard writes, produced scandals. He uses the Latin word scandala. He does not specify what the scandals were. He does not describe them. He does not name the participants or the nature of the conduct that earned the word. He says only that Charlemagne pretended the scandals did not exist. The emperor who controlled every detail of his empire, who regulated the weight of bread and the price of grain and the conduct of monks in monasteries 1,000 miles from his capital, chose not to see what was happening in his own household. Einhard records this choice without commentary. The absence of commentary is itself commentary. Then Einhard asked the detail that completes the picture he has been constructing with such surgical care. The daughters bore children, illegitimate children, born at court without marriages to explain their existence. The children were not hidden. They were acknowledged. They grew up in the palace alongside their mothers, in the household of a grandfather whose response to their existence was the same studied blindness he applied to the scandals that produced them. Einhard was not a careless writer. He was the most deliberate biographer of the medieval period. He modeled his work on Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars. He understood literary structure. He understood implication. He understood that placing the refusal to let daughters marry, the word scandala, and the existence of illegitimate children in a single connected passage created a sequence that readers could follow to a conclusion he could not state directly. The sequence asks a question. Einhard does not answer it. He does not need to. The question answers itself. Who father those children? The daughters were not permitted to marry. They were not permitted to leave court. They lived under the direct and continuous supervision of a man who controlled every aspect of their lives with an authority that no one in the Frankish world could challenge. They existed in a closed system. The palace at Aachen was not a city where anonymous encounters were possible. It was a royal household where the emperor knew the name and function of every person who entered and where his daughter's movements were observed by the entire court. Later sources identify the fathers of some of these children as courtiers, minor nobles, men of insufficient rank to pose any political threat to Charlemagne's authority. Men who could not leverage a relationship with the emperor's daughter into independent power. Men who were in the hierarchy of the Frankish court entirely dependent on Charlemagne's continued favor for their positions and their lives. These identifications raise a question that is as disturbing as the alternative they are sometimes offered to explain. If the fathers were courtiers, they were courtiers conducting relationships with the emperor's daughters in the emperor's own palace under the emperor's observation. With the emperor's evident knowledge, a man who conducted such a relationship without the emperor's approval would not have survived the discovery. Charlemagne executed men for lesser offenses. The courtier survived, which means Charlemagne approved, which means the arrangement was managed, which means the daughters' reproductive lives were controlled by their father as deliberately as every other aspect of their existence at court. Let me know in the comments what you think Einhard was trying to tell us. Because a man who modeled his biography on the most sophisticated classical examples, who chose every word with political awareness, who placed refusal and scandal and illegitimate children in a single passage and then fell silent, was not being careless. He was being as loud as a man in his position could possibly be. The palace at On was the most magnificent court in post-Roman Europe. Charlemagne built it as the permanent capital of his empire. A statement in stone and water and gold that the Frankish kingdom was not a barbarian successor state but the legitimate heir to Rome. Hot springs fed the baths where the emperor swam daily, sometimes inviting his courtiers and his daughters and his guards to join him in the water. A detail Einhard includes with the innocence of a man describing a family outing and the precision of a man preserving evidence. The chapel modeled on the Byzantine church of San Vitale in Ravenna rose in an octagonal tower that dominated the palace complex. The throne room received ambassadors from Baghdad and Constantinople and every kingdom between them. Scholars gathered from across Europe, recruited by Charlemagne's reputation as a patron of learning, forming the intellectual community that historians call the Carolingian Renaissance. Within this complex, Charlemagne's daughters lived in quarters adjacent to their fathers. The proximity was physical and it was constant. Einhard describes them accompanying Charlemagne everywhere. When he traveled, they traveled. When he rode, they rode beside him. When he ate, they sat at his table. When he received foreign ambassadors, his daughters were present, visible, displayed with a pride that the sources describe as paternal, and that the arrangement they lived within complicates beyond what the word paternal can comfortably contain. They could not leave. This is the detail that transforms the golden setting from a palace into something else. A royal daughter in any other Frankish household would have been married by her mid-teens. She would have moved to her husband's court. She would have established her own household, raised her own children, built a life in which her identity was defined by something other than her relationship to her father. Charlemagne's daughters experienced none of this. Their identities were defined entirely by their position within their father's household. They were his daughters. That was the entirety of what they were permitted to be. The scholars at court, the intellectuals whose presence Charlemagne cultivated and whose flattery he rewarded gave the daughters poetic nicknames. Rotud was called Cumba the dove. Bertha received classical allusions that compared her to figures from Greek mythology. The nicknames were affectionate. They were also the vocabulary of a court that had learned to describe the emperor's household in terms that beautified what they could not criticize. The scholars depended on Charlemagne for their positions, their income, their access to the libraries and resources that made their intellectual work possible. They were not going to describe the arrangement they observed in terms that jeopardized their livelihoods. They called the daughters doves and muses and left the darker observations to the man whose biography would outlast their poetry. The golden cage was real. The mosaics were real. The hot springs and the scholars and the ambassadors from Baghdad were real. The daughters' education was real. Their literacy, their presence at the center of European cultural and political life. All of it was real. And none of it changed the fundamental condition of their existence. They could not leave. They could not marry. They could not choose. They lived in the most beautiful prison in Christendom, attended by scholars who compared them to doves and governed by a father whose love, as Einhard so carefully described it, expressed itself as an inability to let them go. The gold on the walls did not make the walls shorter. The learning did not make the cage larger. The beauty of the setting did not alter the nature of the arrangement. They were kept. And the man who kept them was the most powerful person alive, answerable to no one, accountable to nothing except a church whose silence he had purchased with an empire's worth of monasteries and land. The illegitimate children of Charlemagne's daughters are not legend. They are not speculation. They are documented historical facts recorded by multiple sources including Einhard himself. The children existed. They were born at a court. They grew up in the palace at Aachen alongside their mothers in the household of a grandfather who acknowledged their presence without acknowledging the questions their presence raised. Ratrud, Charlemagne's eldest surviving daughter, bore a son named Louis. The father is identified in later sources as a count named Rurico, a man of minor nobility who held his position at court through Charlemagne's patronage. Bertha bore at least 2 children. The father is identified as Angelbert, a poet and courtier who served as one of Charlemagne's advisors and who was later appointed abbot of St. Ryer. Angelberg was a man of genuine literary talent and political skill, but his rank was insufficient to justify a marriage alliance with the emperor's daughter. He was not a king. He was not a prince. He was not the son of a powerful duke whose alliance Charlemagne needed to secure. He was a court intellectual who wrote flattering poetry and received in exchange access to the emperor's daughter under conditions that the emperor determined and controlled. The relationships that produced these children operated under rules that Charlemagne established. This is the point that historians who defend the conventional interpretation must contend with. These were not secret affairs conducted in defiance of a father's authority. They were arrangements that took place inside a father's own household under his continuous observation with his evident knowledge. Einhard says as much. The scandals were known. Charlemagne chose not to see them. But choosing not to see is not the same as not knowing. A man who regulated the price of bread in markets across his empire was not unaware of who was sharing his daughter's quarters in his own palace. The men who fathered these children shared a common characteristic that is more revealing than any single piece of evidence. They were all dependent on Charlemagne. Every one of them held his position, his income, his safety, and his future in the emperor's hands. A count whose lands existed at the emperor's pleasure. A poet whose career depended on the emperor's patronage. These were not men who could challenge Charlemagne's authority. They were not men who could leverage their relationship with the emperor's daughter into independent power. They were men who existed within the emperor's system of control as completely as the daughters themselves did. The pattern suggests an arrangement rather than a series of accidents. Charlemagne refused to let his daughters marry men of equal rank because men of equal rank would take the daughters away from court and would gain political power through the alliance. Instead, the daughters remained at court and bore children by men of inferior rank whose dependence on Charlemagne ensured their silence and their compliance. The daughters' reproductive lives were managed, not by the daughters themselves by their father. The children born from these managed arrangements grew up in the palace as visible evidence of a system that operated in plain sight and that the entire court understood and that no one was in a position to challenge. The question that Einhard embedded in his biography, the question he could not ask directly, but that his careful arrangement of facts was designed to provoke, extends beyond the identity of the fathers. It reaches toward the arrangement itself. A father who kept his daughters captive, who refused to let them leave, who controlled their relationships, who selected the men they were permitted to be with based on those men's inability to threaten his authority, who tolerated the children these relationships produced while maintaining the system that produced them. The word Einhard used was scandala, scandals, plural. Whatever the scandals were, there were enough of them, and they were severe enough to earn that word from a man who chose every word in his biography with the precision of a mason laying stones. Drop a comment about what do you think a man as careful as Ihar meant when he used that word and then immediately fell silent because the silence after the word is where the truth lives. Charlemagne died on January 28, 814 AD. He was 71 years old. He had ruled for 46 years. He had built an empire that stretched across Western Europe. He had been crowned by the Pope. He had fathered at least 18 children. He had conquered peoples and converted them at sword point and constructed a legacy so vast that the man inside it disappeared behind the monument. The way a builder disappears behind the cathedral he has spent his life constructing. What happened to his body after death became one of the strangest and most persistent legends in medieval history. The official account is simple. Charlemagne was buried in the chapel at Aachen on the day he died. He was interred with a ceremony appropriate to an emperor and a man the church would eventually declare a saint. The official account is also incomplete because alongside the official record, a parallel tradition emerged in the decades and centuries following his death that describes something the official version does not address and that the church had every reason to suppress. Charlemagne was not buried in the conventional sense. According to multiple medieval sources, his body was placed in a seated position on a marble throne in a vault beneath the chapel at Aachen. Not lying down, not resting in a sarcophagus in the posture of sleep that Christian burial prescribed, sitting upright on a throne, dressed in the full imperial regalia, crown on his head, scepter in his hand, an open gospel placed on his lap, his body arranged in the exact posture of a living emperor holding court, as though the act of ruling was not something that death had the authority to interrupt. The image is extraordinary. An emperor seated in darkness beneath a chapel dressed in gold, holding the symbols of power he had wielded for nearly half a century, maintaining the posture of authority in a sealed chamber that no one was supposed to enter. The body was not embalmed in the manner of later royal preservations. It was treated with spices and aromatic substances. The standard Frankish method of slowing decomposition, but the treatment was designed to delay decay rather than prevent it. The body would deteriorate. Everyone who placed it on the throne knew it would deteriorate. They seated it anyway. They dressed it in the crown and the vestments and placed the gospel in its hands and sealed the chamber and left an emperor sitting in the dark. The legend persisted because the body remained for nearly 2 centuries. Charlemagne sat on his throne beneath the chapel at Aachen. The vault was sealed. The court moved on. The empire fractured. The Carolingian dynasty weakened and eventually lost the crown to new families. Aachen remained the symbolic center of imperial authority even as actual power shifted elsewhere. And beneath the chapel, in a sealed chamber that accumulated the silence of generations, the emperor sat. The arrangement raises questions that the medieval sources do not answer because the medieval sources did not know how to ask them. Who decided that the emperor should be seated rather than buried? What theology or tradition or personal instruction dictated that the most powerful man in Christendom should spend eternity sitting upright on a throne in a sealed vault? Whether the arrangement reflected Charlemagne's own wishes or the wishes of those who survived him? And what the arrangement reveals about the relationship between the living and the dead in a court where the boundary between devotion and something darker was not always clearly maintained. The year 1 AD, nearly 2 centuries after Charlemagne's death, Emperor Otto III, a young man of 20 who had modeled his entire reign on the image of Charlemagne, who styled himself the renovator of the Roman Empire, who kept Charlemagne's legend at the center of his political identity, the way a priest keeps scripture at the center of his faith, ordered the vault beneath the chapel at Aachen opened. The account of what Otto found comes from multiple sources. The most detailed is the chronicle attributed to Otto of Lamello, a count who was present at the opening and whose description has the specificity of an eyewitness and the strangeness of a scene that exceeded what any witness had prepared himself to see. Charlemagne was still seated on the throne. The body had not fully decomposed. The imperial vestments remained in place, deteriorated, but recognizable. The crown was on his head. The scepter was in his hand. The gospel was open on his lap at a page that the sources do not identify. The spices that had been applied to the body of burial had slowed the process of decay, but had not arrested it entirely. The flesh had drawn back from the face. The nose had partially deteriorated. The fingernails, which continued to grow after death through the retraction of surrounding tissue, had pierced through the gloves that covered the emperor's hands, curving outward like the claws of something that had been sealed in the dark for 200 years. The air in the chamber was heavy. The smell of ancient spices mixing with the smell of what the spices had being applied to conceal. Otto and his attendants entered the vault carrying torches that illuminated a scene that belonged less to history than to a dream constructed from the materials of power and decay. An emperor on his throne dressed in gold, holding the symbols of authority, sitting in darkness for nearly 2 centuries, while the empire he had built fractured and reformed and fractured again above him. Otto knelt. He knelt before the body of a man who had been dead for 186 years, seated on a throne in a sealed vault. And he paid homage the way a subject pays homage to a living sovereign. The gesture was political. Otto needed Charlemagne's legitimacy to support his own claims to imperial authority. But the gesture was also something else, something that the political interpretation alone does not fully account for. Otto did not simply kneel and leave. He touched the body. He repaired the vestments where they had deteriorated. He replaced a piece of the nose that had crumbled. He trimmed the fingernails that had grown through the gloves. He tended to the corpse with an intimacy that went beyond veneration and into a territory that the sources describe without interpreting because interpretation would have required them to name what they were seeing. Otto reportedly took relics from the body before resealing the vault. A tooth, possibly other items. He carried pieces of Charlemagne away from the vault and incorporated them into his own collection of sacred objects. The body of the emperor was not merely preserved. It was accessed. It was touched. It was maintained. It was visited by a successor who knelt before it and handled it and took pieces of it away as though the physical remains of Charlemagne contained a power that could be transferred through contact. The relationship between Otto and the body in the vault was not the relationship between a historian and a relic. It was the relationship between a believer and a source of power that resided in flesh and bone rather than in scripture or prayer. The vault was sealed again. Charlemagne returned to his darkness. The throne held him for another century and a half until Frederick Barbarossa opened the vault again in 1165 and had the remains transferred to a sarcophagus, finally giving Charlemagne the conventional burial that the original arrangement had deliberately withheld. The throne sat empty after that. But for nearly 350 years, an emperor has sat in the dark beneath a chapel in Aachen, dressed in his crown, holding his gospel, maintaining the posture of a ruler who refused to stop ruling even after the body that held the crown had ceased to be a body in any meaningful sense. Assemble the pieces. Place them side by side the way an investigator places evidence on a table and steps back to see the pattern that the individual fragments conceal when they are examined alone. A man who allegedly fathered a child with his own sister. A relationship so transgressive that the official court histories erased it entirely and that only the literary traditions operating outside the church's editorial control preserved it. Encoding the truth inside the word nephew and trusting that someone would eventually understand what the word contained. A child named Roland, who became the greatest hero in medieval French literature, whose legend was built on a foundation that could never be spoken aloud, whose death in a mountain pass produced grief in his father, so overwhelming that the poem struggles to contain it within the word it uses to describe the relationship. Uncle. The word says uncle. The grief says father. The tradition says both and neither and waits for the reader to choose. A man who kept every one of his daughters captive at court for their entire lives. Who refused to allow any of them to marry despite the fact that marriage alliances were the most powerful diplomatic tool available to him. And despite the fact that he used every other diplomatic tool with masterful precision, who explained the refusal through his biographer as love too deep for separation, who controlled his daughters' relationships by permitting them access only to men too weak and too dependent to challenge his authority, who tolerated the birth of illegitimate children in his own household while maintaining the system that produced them, whose biographer used the word scandala to describe what the arrangement generated and then fell silent with a silence louder than any sentence he could have written. A man whose biographer, a member of his own household, a witness to the daily life of the court, constructed a passage of such careful implication that 12 centuries of scholarship have not exhausted its meaning. The refusal to let daughters marry, the scandals that followed, the illegitimate children born in the emperor's palace. Each detail placed beside the next, with the precision of a man building a case he cannot prosecute, but can preserve for a future court that might have the freedom to hear it. Einhard could not accuse the emperor he served. He could record what he observed in a sequence that any attentive reader could follow to its conclusion. He did exactly that. And then he stopped writing and trusted the silence to speak. A man whose body was placed on a throne after death and maintained in a sealed vault for nearly 350 years, seated upright, dressed in imperial regalia, holding the symbols of power. Visited by successors who knelt before the corpse and touched it and took pieces of it away. An arrangement that the church tolerated because the man on the throne was the man whose authority the church had blessed and whose legacy the church needed to remain sacred. The relationship between the living court and the dead emperor, between the successors who opened the vault and the body they found still seated in its crown, occupied a space between veneration and something that veneration alone cannot explain. Return to Roland, the pass at Rono, the horn that was blown too late, the hero dying with his sword beneath his body and his face towards Spain. The poem that made him immortal. The word nephew beating through the text like a second pulse. Charlemagne collapsing on the body of the young knight and weeping with a grief that the poem cannot contain within the kinship term it uses to describe the relationship. The father of Europe mourning the son he could never acknowledge. The secret buried inside the most famous poem in medieval literature, preserved in a word, hidden in plain sight. Waiting 1,000 years for someone to hear what the poets had been saying all along. The chapel at Aachen is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists visit it every day. They photographed the octagonal architecture that Charlemagne commissioned from builders who studied Byzantine designs and adapted them for a Frankish emperor who wanted his capital to rival Constantinople. They stand in the space where the throne once held a dead man dressed in gold. And they learn about the father of Europe, the patron of learning, the defender of Christendom, the king of hearts on the playing card, the saint whose relics are displayed in a golden shrine that draws pilgrims from across the Christian world. The version of Charlemagne that survives in textbooks and cathedrals and playing cards is the version that 12 centuries of careful management have produced. The church needed a saint. The dynasty needed a founder beyond reproach. The literary tradition needed a hero whose lineage could inspire rather than disturb. Each institution took the raw material of Charlemagne's life and shaped it into the form that served its purposes. The uncomfortable pieces were removed. The edges were smoothed. The portrait that emerged was a portrait of greatness, uncomplicated by the details that would have made greatness impossible to claim. The sister whose name barely survives in the official record. Gisela Gillen, a woman who appears in the margins of history as a shadow that someone tried to erase but could not fully eliminate because shadows persist even when the light that cast them has been redirected. She existed. She lived at court. The literary traditions that the church could not fully suppress preserved a version of her story that the church spent centuries trying to bury. The poets remembered her. The chanson deist remembered her. The word nephew remembered her every time it appeared in the Song of Roland. 1,000 repetitions of a code word that contained the truth about a mother and a son and a relationship that could never be named. The daughters who were never allowed to leave. Rotud, Bertha, Gisla, Theodrata, Hiltrud. Women born into the most powerful family in Christendom, who spent their entire lives inside a palace they could not leave, bearing children they could not raise in freedom, governed by a father whose love expressed itself as captivity, and whose control extended into the most private dimensions of their existence. Einhard preserved their story in the only form he could. A biography that says everything by saying almost nothing. A passage that places the evidence in sequence and trusts the reader to follow the sequence to its end. 12 centuries later, the passage still reads like testimony delivered under oath by a witness who was forbidden to state his conclusion, but who arranged his facts so that the conclusion was inescapable. The children born in the golden cage, illegitimate, acknowledged but unexplained, growing up in a palace where the questions surrounding their existence were understood by everyone and spoken by no one. The fathers who were permitted access to the emperor's daughters because their weakness guaranteed their silence. The arrangement that Einhard called scandala and that the court absorbed the way the court absorbed everything that the emperor's power made untouchable and the body on the throne. The dead emperor seated in darkness for 350 years, dressed in his crown, holding his gospel, maintaining the posture of authority in a sealed vault. While the world above him changed beyond recognition, the empire fractured. The dynasty fell. New kings wore new crowns. And beneath the chapel, in the silence that accumulated year after year after year, Charlemagne sat. The father of Europe. Along with whatever the darkness knew about him that the light had been forbidden to reveal. If what you have learned today matters, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button and the notification bell. Share this video with anyone who learned about Charlemagne in school and was taught only the version that the playing card preserves. Drop a comment telling me which piece of this story changes how you see the father of Europe. And tell me where you are watching from. Because the truth has been waiting inside a word in a biography in a sealed vault for 12 centuries. It has been patient. It is done being silent. But Charlemagne was not the only ruler whose private life was erased to protect a legend that nations were built on. There is another chapter from another court where the secret was darker and the silence lasted even longer. That story is waiting for you right now.